Welcome to my team's team review for May 2nd, 2024. I'm going to start off by reading the mantra, and then Michael Fangman will review or walk us through the latest iteration of the MR security redesign thingamajig. All right. I should place here. So as we're reviewing this, remember that we are not our designs. We will not offend anyone in this room intentionally. We'll practice benevolent radical candor, which is to care personally but challenge directly when sending feedback. We'll be open to receiving benevolent radical candor feedback, and will be, if necessary, willing to let go of things that aren't working. These sessions are about candid talk, spirited debate, fun, and a passion for what we do as designers for a living. All right. Michael, please take it away.
All right. So I will share my screen and I will just give a quick high-level overview of the problem we're solving, because I know Becca and Justin, you're pretty familiar with it, but Graham, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to get caught up. So let me find Figma here somewhere. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. So sort of at a high level, what we're looking to solve here. So within merge requests today, we have for ultimate users, a lot of security features in there. But the workflows and the transparency around those, there's some problematic areas. For instance, we have security policies today in merge requests, which when evaluated, basically can enforce that certain security violations need to be resolved or basically approved or reviewed before the merge can actually go through. And how that works today is that whenever a security policy shows up or is being evaluated for a merge request, we immediately put an approval rule on the merge request. But it's not very clear to users that that approval rule is directly related to security policies that are in place. And so we've seen a lot of feedback where people will see that security or that approval request, and they'll just go out and request approval without actually the policies being fully evaluated and knowing what basically needs to be dealt with. So I guess there's a little bit of a problem around like connecting the security policies with that approval rule. And so we want to try to make that process a little bit more transparent, so that way when there are policy violations present in merge request, users can understand what those are and then understand what they need to do to unblock it, i.e. either deal with it or request approval from a security approver. And then the other problem we're looking to solve here is that on the main overview page for the merge request, for ultimate users, we have multiple widgets going on. So we have the security widget, we have the code quality widget, and we have the license compliance widget. All of those add a lot of noise and complexity to the merge request overview today, and they don't really provide a great experience for like triaging and dealing with these vulnerabilities, because you're kind of left in this small widget box and you have like scrolling within scrolling. It's kind of a weird experience all in all. So we're looking to reduce the complexity of the overview and just create a better experience for triaging and dealing with security issues within a merge request. So that's sort of the high level problem. Any questions there before we dig in? Cool. Sounds good. So I shared an earlier version of this a few weeks back, where we were looking at essentially just revamping the widgets to highlight policy violations there. After a little bit of review of that with the PMs, we've decided to go a different direction. And instead of having everything in widgets, we're looking to actually create a new tab. Right now it's labeled as the reports tab. But the name is still to be decided. Largely, it's only going to be security and code quality stuff in there, at least for the initial iteration. So any suggestions or feedback on what we might call this tab for it to be just clear to users, definitely open to that. But I'll start by walking through the changes on the overview page, and then we'll dig into the reports tab itself. So my mouse would work. I don't know why it's not letting me scroll. I'll just reload the prototype. Maybe that will help.
I had an issue in Figma yesterday too, when I was showing a prototype where it wouldn't let me scroll.
Yeah, it's super weird. So I was just looking at it yesterday and it was working fine.
It's because you're sharing it.
There we go.
Okay, cool.
There we go. Okay, we're good. But I need to get to the right tab. Cool. So we have sort of two versions of this. We have a larger vision of what we're hoping to work towards. Those designs are a little bit outdated, but nevertheless, we also have an MVC, kind of the first iteration of what we're looking for here. So coming in on the overview, basically the first changes we're looking to make here is that when a security policy is being evaluated for a merge request, instead of using the approval rules as a blocking mechanism, we're actually going to use these merge checks or this merge sort of status widget as the primary way to block policies. And so there's two different checks we're looking to add here. So as soon as we know that there's a security policy that needs to be evaluated for a merge request, we would apply this all security policies must be evaluated check here. And that's going to persist until the pipeline finishes and all the policies have been evaluated, and then that check's going to go away. And then as soon as a policy finds any policy violation, we're going to add another merge check that says all policy violations must be resolved. And that's going to be the longstanding blocking mechanism for the merge request to basically ensure that these issues get dealt with before the code can get merged. And both of these have a link out. They actually go to the same section, which is the landing page for this reports tab, which I'll get to in a minute. Different names right now, but they both kind of link to the same content because it's all the policies and the violations are all mixed into a single view.
Yeah, wait, I'm confused on that. Are they redundant or how are they different? All security policies must be evaluated. All policy violations must be resolved.
Yeah, so there is a chance they'll both show up at the same time, but they are sort of a little bit different. So the all security policies must be evaluated. That check is only in place while the pipeline's running and while these security policies are being evaluated. And as soon as the policy evaluation is done, whether there's policy violations or not, that check gets removed.
Mm.
And then the other
And the
check
reason they
is,
could show up
Yep.
at the same time is because there could be multiple jobs for multiple policies, and one of them could have found violations already.
yes. So as soon as a policy violation is known, then we would apply this other check. And so that can be applied while other policies are still being evaluated.
So all security policies must be evaluated means that they're still being, like the policies are still being looked at?
Yeah, so basically the pipeline's still running and they're still doing the checks, looking at the pipelines to see if the merge request violates any of these policies.
Is it
Okay.
clear that we're waiting on the pipeline to finish? Because that was like, my question was, it's not clear, but will it be clear to these users?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this should be like a loading state because I mean, also I'm looking at pipeline must succeed and with like a error, like it didn't happen
Mhm.
icon. And so it looks like it didn't succeed, but really what's happening is it's just still in progress. I'm wondering like, yeah, if you should be more like loading.
Yeah,
Yeah, like,
so we're sort of accounting for
this
that in
needs to
different
be
ways.
tied to that somehow.
Yeah, so for these merge checks, we only have pass or fail. We don't have a loading state right now. If they introduced a loading state, it would make sense that this all security policies must be evaluated would be a loading state. But what we're doing to sort of compensate that, and we'll sort of jump ahead here, is that when you go and actually look at the security policies, we'd be showing the state of each of those. So if a policy is still being evaluated, you would get a loading state here. And then if policy violations have been found and it's complete, you would get a blocking state. And if it was evaluated and no policy violations were found, you'd get a success state. So we're trying to sort of close the loop once you get to the policy page. But I would agree that if we did have a loading state for this merge check, it would make sense that that would be a loading state versus a blocking state.
Well, and it's
Is there
also
a reason
just
why
like,
we can't do that?
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a question for code review to decide if they want to introduce that as a state for these checks or not. So, but currently it doesn't exist yet.
I mean, you're doing it. You're forcing the user to go to a different page to see it.
Mhm.
It's like, why isn't that same information here? And then these guys are disabled or not, maybe not disabled, but like, I don't need to go there right now. What's the point? But I do have to go there in order to find out the truth about these.
Mhm.
I talked to a security team lead a couple weeks ago who said that as soon as developers see anything regarding security, they reach out to her and say like, hey, can you look at this? They just try to pass it muster.
Of
And
course, it's too hard.
yeah,
Security's
so
hard.
my concern here without a loading state is, developers see this and they're like, this is, reach out to the security team if there is one. And then the security team has to be like, oh, it's just not done loading. It just feels like, when it is a true positive, when there are actually violations that need to be reviewed, like if they always see this, then there's going to be like alert fatigue. And
Yep.
they're never going to trust it if this is the default state. How do they know the difference between loading and there's actually something they need to review?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And I think that's a question I can raise with the code review team to see if they would want to introduce a new state here, because it would make things a little bit more clear.
Is
So
there like a place that we can, like an issue or in that thread, so we can kind of, it's not all on you to like give this feedback over?
yes, did I list the issues in the didn't list the issues in here. I will grab them real quick and put them in the agenda. But there is
Oh,
a
no, you did in the Slack thread. Here are the issues the work is related to.
okay, yep, yeah. One of those issues is that basically is around policies should be evaluated as a merge check. That would be the issue to put it in.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I imagine it's easier if I like ask Kai and Michael or whoever else directly. So that
Yeah.
way all the feedback isn't necessarily coming from you. I don't, would that be helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate
Okay.
that.
Cool.
Cool. So anyway, when a policy, or basically when the pipeline does finish, you would kind of get a state like this. So you'd see that the check or the pipeline is successful, and then that evaluation blocker would be removed, and then you'd only have this long-standing all policies must be resolved as the blocking mechanism. But nevertheless, so coming down the page, so the other change we're looking at here, so today we have the security widget, we have the code quality widget, and we have the license compliance widget. What we're looking to do is potentially minimize that footprint on the overview page and wrap all of that into a single widget. So language is still to be determined, but right now I have it as like merge reports. So it says 3 merge reports and then highlighting policy violations across all the findings. And then you could open this widget to basically get a summary of all of the security or all of the different like reports. And then we'd have links to direct users to the reports tab to view the full details for each of those reports, or this main link across the top that directs them to that main landing page for the reports tab. And so effectively what we're doing here is that today we direct users to this pipeline security tab, which shows what's been introduced by the merge request, as well as everything else in the main branch. And that's not super helpful for users to be able to understand what has been introduced by their code changes. So each of these reports would now link to their own dedicated reports area within the reports tab. And this is effectively just taking what's in the widgets today and dumping them into these individual reports on the separate tab for the MVC. So it's very similar to like what we have in the widgets, just giving them a bigger, more dedicated area. One thing that came up when I was talking through this with Michael Lay is if this widget is even necessary. And I think to some degree, maybe it is, but his point was that if something needs to be dealt with security-wise, we have this all policy violations must be resolved as the sort of blocking mechanism and as the sort of indicator to dig into the security stuff. And so this is sort of driving users to that reports tab, which is a more feature-rich, bigger area to deal with this stuff versus this smaller widget. But I also know that from a marketing perspective and a demo sharing our capabilities perspective, a lot of people will go to the merge request and say, we have security, look at these widgets. And there's also
the same deal will be on the report. Like instead of going to the widget, you just go to the report.
Yeah, exactly. A couple scenarios
I need to share
where
that from a marketing perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then instead of just pointing to this overview, they can be like, we have a whole tab dedicated to security, so it could be just as easy of a sell. The reason why I think it may be worthwhile to consider keeping this for some iteration of this is 2 things. So if somebody's not using security policies for a merge request today, they wouldn't see blocking mechanisms. So there'd be nothing on the overview directing them to go view that reports tab if there are findings found. And then also for free and premium users who don't have access to security policies, there would also be no indication on this overview that there's any security stuff to look at. So how do we indicate to users that there are findings they should look at from this overview? And I think that's sort of serving that purpose right now, or could serve that purpose, but maybe it's not necessary. I don't know.
I wonder if it's this or that. So if they don't have policies set up, then they have this widget. If they do have policies set up, then we can take some of this content and move it up to the merge blocked widget.
Yeah.
Like maybe it would be nice to know that you've got overall, 10 problems that you need to solve.
Mm-hmm.
Give them a little bit more of a kick to say, hey, you should click on this view policies or view violations button. So maybe there's a way to merge it if you do have policies, but then if you don't, then this widget lives.
There's also the scenario where policies are in place, but it doesn't actually find anything, but maybe there are other security issues that are present that are important to deal with, but aren't picked up by policies, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Could this exist within the merge blocked widget?
Potentially it could, but there's a lot of different checks in the merge block widget today. So adding something like the security stuff, giving it a bigger footprint in the merge block widget may sort of be breaking the paradigm that they've established there. Yeah, so something to think about.
Those are interesting. I also wonder about the placement. Why are they below the pipeline?
The way I have this set up, and this is just my own rationale, there's actually everything's flip-flopped in the merge request today, but I thought basically this is the first sort of command center of what needs to be dealt with for the merge request.
Right.
And then based on the order of how this stuff was presented, and I haven't changed that, I arranged stuff in that same order. So pipeline must succeed, so pipeline's first, policy violation, so that'd be the next one down, approvals being last, and then approval. So there's sort of a
Okay.
relationship there. But like I said, today, this is all flip-flopped the opposite way, I believe.
Do those other bottom widgets even show up unless there's something in them?
They do show up, they have a loading state.
So the merge
I
report
believe.
has loading state and requires approvals on the loading state.
Yes. So, I mean, I guess the merge report stuff doesn't exist today, but our security, code quality, and all of that have a loading state they populate in until the
Right, so it follows
the
the same
pipeline's
pattern.
finished. Yep. So, but we could change it for sure.
Yeah, I wonder if, if we can't have a loading state and we have to ship this version, if it would make more sense to have the pipeline, merged results pipeline running at the top that contextualizes the pipeline must succeed a little bit more for me. I've already seen that it's still running. There are still steps in progress. And so that makes pipeline must succeed a little bit more
Yeah, I could see that.
contextual. Yeah.
The reason
I
I
also wonder if
position
there's a way to squish it. Can we compress it too?
it
Since it's
being
more of an
this
indicator.
the pipeline or the merge block
The
widget or
pipeline,
something
just the
else.
pipeline widget container. Why does it need to be that tall?
It's a good question. I left it as is. I didn't really change it. So I kind of felt like it was more in the scope of the code reviews purview versus this.
Well, what
Like
would
in line
squishing it do, Justin?
Well, it's a progress meter, and to your point, putting it above is like this thing, this progress is going to cause everything below it
Yeah,
to fill, to get content.
Mhm.
yeah. Because we
But
don't
there's
actually
a
know
lot
what
of
all the findings are
superfluous.
until all the
Yeah.
jobs finish running.
Mhm.
And some jobs
But
might be skipped or some might fail, but the pipeline's allowed to succeed anyways. I know we can like fail a pipeline if a job fails, but that's not necessarily the case. So it does kind of contextualize the other.
Sure. So it sounds like having the pipeline be the first widget that we see here probably would be better than the merge block being the first point of like first thing the users encounter.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's a simple change, and I think today the pipeline widget is first, so we just maintain that. Would it make sense? So today the merge block widget is the very last widget. Does that still make sense, or do you think it should be the first after the pipeline?
I think the merge block is still, it still goes along with that mergeability mental model. Like their primary goal is to merge. So that's the
Mhm.
first thing that they'll want to review. I think that still makes sense to me.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's
Why
get
is
in.
the
Oh, go ahead.
icon, so merge blocked has the same icon as 3 merge reports. Does that icon imply that the merge request can't proceed with being merged without doing these things? Or is that read just like we found things you need to review? I
So
guess
in the
there's 2 blockers. Is that what's causing that?
So how this is working is that this is representing this blocking status is if policy violations exist, nothing else. So code quality doesn't utilize security report or security policies today. So in this case, it's a warning. Blockers is just the status of the
Oh,
severity.
right. I felt for this last time too. Oh, I hate code quality has to change that.
Yeah, they've determined that they're
Can't
not
say
going
2
to.
blockers, but have it not be blockers of the merge request.
Yeah, well, that's why we're not using blocker as a language in the merge request here. We're using policy violations.
But it does say merge blocked at the top.
It does, yes. That's true. So there is some incongruence there or potential confusion. But nevertheless, so for any report that has policy violations, we would be showing this blocked, and then whatever the highest severity is for these reports just rolls up to the widget status.
Hmm.
And then, so coming into, so if you were to click on any of these links to go view violations, it would take you to this reports tab. And the very first like default landing page for that is focused on security policies. So as I had mentioned, you can see all of the policies that are being evaluated for this merge request, the state of them. And then if it is complete and there are violations, you would see those violations directly here. I don't know why none of these links are loading properly. The prototype is broken. There they are. So yeah, then for each policy, you basically have the policy details accessible from a drawer. So this allows people to understand what each policy is actually being evaluated and what needs to be done to basically unblock it. And so this is just pulling mostly from the policy configuration area. There's this drawer that exists today in that policy creation UI. So it's just pulling that in, but with a few slight additions. So one addition is this comparisons pipeline area. That's something new that recently got added to the security policy bot. And that's more of a troubleshooting mechanism. So if there is questions or issues around what these policy violations are, it's a way for users to see what pipelines are actually compared against to come up with this result. And there's still some unknown questions around if this is the right placement for that or not. Because it sounds like these comparison policy pipelines the same pipelines can apply to multiple policies. And it's a little bit confusing. It's still something I have to figure out more. But nevertheless, so you have access to the policy details themselves here, and then also to the findings. So then for any policy violation, you could click and get, for now, we're going to open it in a drawer. Eventually, we'll look at doing a full page here, but basically accessing the vulnerability details, looking at indicating if it's a policy violation directly at the top here. So that way, if you do come across these vulnerabilities in, say, the changes tab or elsewhere in the merge request, outside of this sort of policy focused view, you still can see if each finding is a violation or not and if it needs to be remediated. And then, so originally I had, or not originally, there was a while where I was exploring, instead of doing the approval workflow as the blocking mechanism, sort of encouraging users to actually act on each of these individual findings. So for each policy violation, you either have to resolve it or request a specific exception from a reviewer to basically allow that to be merged in. But we met with Grant last week to walk him through these designs, and his feedback was that while the exception workflow seems really nice, he hasn't gotten a lot of feedback or negative feedback around problems with the approval workflow. And so because of that, he was thinking it makes sense to just maintain our status quo of requesting approval on these policies, which I think makes sense. And obviously changing that workflow would create a lot of work for the security team. So what we're looking to is just trying to promote more transparency around this approval process now, because each security policy can have its own unique set of approval guidelines and approvers, list of approvers. So what I wanted to do here, so today in the merge request, if you wanted to request approval for a policy, you basically have to go to that approval widget and somehow make the connection around which policy and which approval requirement is. So it's a little bit confusing. So I added this action here to request approval for each individual policy, and there may be some overlap from who can approve which policies, but that workflow, this I haven't shared with Kai or Alana yet, so I'll have to get their feedback too. But basically, when you hit this request approval button, I wanted to open up a modal that provides a little bit more context around what actually happens here. The copy still needs to go through tech writing and get reviewed and stuff, but basically providing some context around like this security policy, or when this security policy approval is given, the code changes will be allowed to merge, even if the listed policy violations are not resolved. So providing some sort of information so users know what to expect. And they could come in here and choose their approver, who they want to request it from whoever the list of eligible approvers are from the policy. You could potentially add a comment to that approver if you wanted to, and then you could request that approval. And I'm not sold on this design yet, but when a approval request has been put out there, I thought it'd be nice to indicate that directly on each policy so that users know if approval request has been given or not. So adding a badge here in some way, shape, or form to show that. And then clicking on this badge, so this is another addition I was thinking about adding. On the overview page in the activity section, instead of having approvals not really have any context, looking to add a line item here. So in this case, we have Bree Barker requested approval from Annette Black for whatever the policy is. And if they added a comment, you can directly associate that comment here too. So it provides the reviewer with some context. So once they get a notification that their request has been, or approval request has been requested, saying words weird, we could link directly to this comment. So then they could come into the merge request and see exactly what's being requested to them. They can get context from this comment, reply to it, and have a discussion directly here. And then they could go and view that policy. And if they have approval rights, instead of having this request approval button, they would just have the approve button. And I don't have the rest of it mapped out, but essentially it would just add the approval to the merge request then.
But do you think it'll ask them to add a comment?
Today we don't have comments for approvals. You can just grant an approval.
It's just approving it. Okay, so it's
Yes.
following the same as the merge request approval, basically.
Exactly. Because that's essentially what they're doing, is they're approving the merge request, but we're contextualizing it to the policy, which there's a little bit of a weird reality there. Because they have to approve the merge request to unblock the policy.
Oh.
Which is why I wanted to move away from the approval workflow and actually go towards an exception, like dealing with each of these violations themselves. I think that's a better workflow to promote, but I know there's a lot of work to bring that into reality.
Eventually, it seems like it should be just an approval on this policy, because otherwise I'd feel pressure to Like, I don't want to approve the entire merge request. I can't speak to, I don't write Ruby, and so I can't,
Yeah,
And what if
prove it
they're
generally.
reviewers on multiple policies? But they don't approve policy number 2, but they approve policy number 1, but now they've approved the entire merge request.
Although I
Yep.
guess they wouldn't approve the merge request if they had a problem with one policy. But yeah, I think it would be more clear if they can say, okay, I approve this one, but this one we're gonna
Mhm.
on.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that would change today because if there are multiple policies and they have different approval requirements, but the same person is included in both of those, they effectively could add their approval to the merge request and it would approve both policies.
Mhm.
Mm,
And that would still stand today. And I know that's sort of not clear and seems problematic to me.
yeah. I'm wondering if that approve button is that, how does the approver come in and approve?
Today,
Oh,
they just have this approve button on the actual approval widget, and that's what they would have to click, or they could use a quick action to approve. So we're just basically duplicating this and bringing it over to the policy itself to give contextually approving, but it could be misleading too, because it's probably not clear that they are approving the whole merge request by clicking this button.
right.
So like, I think the
It's
general
definitely not
workflow is a
clear.
little broken. Yeah. I don't think approval is the right action we want here, but that's what we have. So because approvals are being used as a blocking mechanism right now for policies, because that was the easiest way to do it. I believe, I don't want to say easiest. That was what they determined was the simplest way to use policies as a blocking mechanism.
Hmm.
I wonder
like, I
if
think,
we could do
go ahead.
some testing to validate that this is actually a problem for users.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, when we were talking to Grant about it, he said that he hadn't heard much feedback that it is problematic, the approval stuff, but from like a workflow standpoint, it definitely seems a little disconnected. And I know
Yeah,
Kai
like, is this
tended to like the idea of the exception request because approval is sort of heavy-handed and it is like, this is like everything's good for this merge request, and that's not necessarily
right?
what we're doing here.
Like, I wonder if the nuance is just being missed for the users that are using policies because maybe there's just not enough of them. Maybe there's not enough dual policies that are conflicting with each other.
Mhm.
I'm also wondering if there's a need to have like a create issue button. Like I haven't talked to like policy creators and approvers a lot since that's not really my group, but I'm wondering if there's a use case similar to vulnerabilities where it's like, okay, this is low enough risk to approve or to unblock, this merge request, but I do want to, oh, do you have it
Well,
in
that's what
there?
the
Like, I
policy
want
this-
to follow up. Oh, there it
is
is.
pulling
Great.
in
Yeah,
vulnerabilities.
this still
The policy
exactly.
is defining rules when a MR has a vulnerability. So it's still about addressing a vulnerability or not.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that would be the workflow we should promote personally, is acting on these vulnerabilities, not the policy.
Yeah.
And so what I originally had in here is that there was an exception request button here instead of these, if you don't have the proper permissions, and that would open up a modal where you could then choose for each finding who you want to review it. And then once they come in here, they would see basically that their exception request has been requested, and they could come in and then either act on each finding to dismiss it, create an issue, or deny that exception.
And if I want to start a conversation with the MR author about this, would I just leave a comment on the overview page?
Yeah, so when it comes related to approvals, we do have, and I don't know if this will actually stick or not. I haven't talked to the PMs about this, but essentially creating a thread around the approval.
Right, okay.
So long-term vision-wise, it'd be nice to, for each finding, we have a whole dedicated page and then introducing like discussions on the findings themselves, so you can actually collaborate and work through each finding. That's not something we'll pursue for the MVC, I don't think.
Mm.
So this sort of mechanism would probably be, if it does get buy-in, would be the way to do it, or just adding a general comment in the merge request.
I think we need to figure out a way to do some research to see if users, once they understand what we're doing and what this will allow them to do, if they're
Mhm.
okay with it.
Yeah,
Because approving a policy when it's got 10 criticals in it, I guess you just wouldn't approve it if there's one critical that you don't approve of. Like, but that seems a little blanket.
yeah,
blanket.
the blanket
You know?
approval is definitely, doesn't seem like it's the right way to go. But
Yeah.
that's what we are using today for sure.
So I'd like to, well, we don't have a researcher. I'd like to talk to somebody in UXR to figure out how to do that without explicitly saying, by the way, this is what you're doing. Are you okay with this? Like, I want them to explore the UI and then realize, like, oh, wait. So I don't know how to do that, but maybe somebody in
Yeah,
UXR can.
agreed. Yeah. And we can certainly try to put together two versions of a prototype if that would help, and do some like unmoderated testing might be a way to go. Basically, create two studies, one with the approval workflow, one with the exception workflow, and just see how successful users
Which
are
is
across them.
better. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then we can ask if they get them to talk out loud about why they like one over the other.
hmm hmm
And
Yeah, because
hope
I
that they'll
think
say, because it's granular, it needs to be granular. I can't, I'm not going
exactly.
to approve a policy when there's 20 things in there and 5 of them are good and 15 are bad or whatever.
Yeah, and I think there'll be some disconnect, like some confusion for people that aren't super familiar with how things work today around like what this request approval is actually applying and what they're approving and stuff. I think they won't know that it's actually applying to the full merge request versus these policies.
Did you say that? Did you say that in your dialogue?
I did not.
Yeah, I mean,
When the
that's
security
in red
policy is a
flashing. You're approving the entire MR.
Yeah.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
something
Adding
that's like,
clarification here would make sense.
seriously, I get it. You're not going to read this dialogue, but read this.
Yeah, that almost seems like a blocker to me. Like I would say a requirement of an MVC is only letting people block or approve one policy at a time. Like,
hmm Yeah, and I know that would have a snowball effect for the security policies team and create a lot of work because they'd have to change how their UI works and stuff. And so that would potentially prolong this work being actually implemented is the other flip side.
although I guess, I mean, what if the button is just on the merge request page? I mean, I'm kind of going back against what I said earlier, like, oh, I can't approve the whole merge request. I'm only approving the UX side of it, but like, that's what I do when I add an approval. I'm just approving the UX on it. I can't evaluate everything because I'm not a developer. So I'm always wondering, what if we just like removed the approve from this page and just had that like general approve button on the overview page? Because that's clearer that like I'm giving my approval on the whole thing rather than per policy.
That's very true. And I think that could work, but the workflow aspect of that, like how do we connect users from these are the policies? How do you request an approval that would unblock these policies? Like trying to connect those dots for users, I think is one of the current problems today.
Could you just append them to each other in the modal for the approval workflow so that when a user goes into approvals and they click like on the screen you had where two of these buttons had been approved because they were requested for those two policy changes or
Oh, yep.
policy approvals.
Mhm.
They can click either of them, and it opens a modal that then relists somehow. Like it would be dynamic, which is probably a bigger tech like lift, but
Mhm.
that user would just see a summary of all of the policies that they were requested, or that they had to approve, and then it's a singular like approve all for the merge request,
Right.
Mhm.
instead of going through each one, because I really like the workflow here, and I like that it's all interconnected. I think that's like exceptionally well done.
Thanks.
I think the only thing that's really missing is just in this case, it's assumed that they're going through each of them individually. So is there a way to make it so that the approval does recap all of it, and it kind of forces them to relook at like every single one and go, yeah, these are all approved. Because in the end, like in the current workflow, if they're not okay with one of them, then they're not going to approve the merge request.
Mhm.
So it makes
I like
sense to
that.
do the same thing here.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it would, if we could essentially like take this approval widget and contextualize it in a modal in this
Yeah.
other context, I think that would help clarify that what their action is actually doing.
Yeah.
I like that. It's a great suggestion, Graham.
Yeah, and Graham, thank you for starting off with something like very positive there. Like, Michael, this is so impressive. Like, we're
Mm.
being really picky and jumping to those kind of areas of
Yeah.
concern. Like,
Well,
this
it's
is
important
so
though to work
impressive
through
that
those
you've
picky
created
things.
this entire framework. Like this, it's so much, and trying to work within the limitations of how policies work and how MRs work and like
Mhm.
restrictions. Like, this is just so impressive. So
Thank you.
bravo.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Cool. I know we are well over time already. I have a little extra time if there's other questions or feedback or anything like that, but if not, we can certainly call it too.
Sadly, I don't. I have to jump to another call, which means as soon as I leave, you'll probably all get disconnected.
Fair enough.
If we have anything else that comes to mind, is that linked issue that you linked in Slack, the way to?
Yeah, so that, or you can just come into the prototype or the Figma file and leave comments that way too. Either
Okay.
way works.
Cool.
Awesome.
I did
Thanks for
take
sharing.
notes on everyone's main topics to help you figure out
Awesome.
where to go next. So,
Appreciate that. Thanks for all the feedback.
all right. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, bye all.
Yeah.
Bye.